motivation, what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, some questions, and the big question, I guess, is this is such a serious subject. Should we be looking at it perhaps through the eyes of satire? Now, we've prepared a short 2-minute video about the book that might put everything into context. So perhaps we could show that.
Okay, just getting it up.
Can we go?
Yes, if you could share your screen now, that'd be great.
You know, if you look around the world, we're facing lots of problems. This COVID, this criminal justice, civil liberties, violence, hunger. And of course, there's the environment. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I get compassion fatigue. There's so much going on. There's so many things that we're supposed to look at. There's so many things we're supposed to fix. And the attitude of many people is expressed in this cartoon, and I'll give you a moment to read it yourself.
You haven't got it on the screen right now?
I'm sorry?
You haven't shared your screen?
Sorry.
So you should see your, if you press the share screen green button.
I don't see it. I had it, we just had it, didn't we?
It should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Have you got the Zoom screen in front of you?
Ah, that's what I have, yes. How's that?
You're not sharing yet? Oh, there it comes.
And let me do this slideshow.
Yeah.
Thank you. Is that okay?
Perfect,
Good.
thank you.
I don't know, do you have compassion fatigue? Do you have the feeling of this gentleman sitting in front of his TV. Take a moment to read this cartoon. Well, is that right? That if we ignore things, ignore the problems, they will go away? Not really. And my particular interest is nature conservation. And I thought it would be useful just to give a sense of background for how the book developed, how the conservation world has evolved over the years. And I know a lot of you watching in the audience have been involved very actively in conservation. So I hope we can have an interesting discussion at the end about what's going on, what steps we might take to solve the problem. When I joined WWF in 1980, we basically had one objective, and that was to put conservation on the agenda. And the focus initially was on the charismatic megavertebrates. These were largely animals found in distant countries from the countries in which we were fundraising. And there was a very emotive appeal. But we realized that wasn't enough, and the conservation movement evolved into protected areas, ecosystems, legislation, treaties, economics, and so on. And it didn't take too long for us to realize that there was also an element of consumer responsibility. We were always juggling two different approaches, which would be more effective not only in conservation, but also in fundraising. And let's be very clear that fundraising was an important part of the whole dynamic. On the one hand, we had the doom and gloom. We're finished, the species is going extinct. Unless we do something right now, we're game's over. And you've heard this kind of Chicken Little analysis over and over. We see it with climate change all the time, don't we? If we do nothing now, in 20 years, Jakarta will be completely underwater, Miami will be underwater, our crops will be destroyed, and so on and so on. But then we tried to balance it with the idea of hope. Now, this is a famous ad produced by David Ogilvy, who at that time was a board member of WWF. And it showed that you can make a difference. You can succeed. And this is one of the great ads of advertising. Now, were we successful? Well, yes, we were successful in putting conservation on the agenda. We put it on the agenda of economics, politics, even civil liberties. Have we solved the problems? Not at all. And this is the thing I'd like to talk to you about today, is what happens when this rainforest ecosystem is turned into a monoculture of oil palm. If you go close up in this picture, what you will find are oil palm trees. Do you know how many species of palm trees there are in the world? Well, there's 2,600 palm species, and they're all gorgeous trees. They're all beautiful trees. Palm trees are trees that are dressed for the opera, and they're not only gorgeous, but they're incredibly useful because they produce palm oil. Now let's look at the good and the bad and the ugly of oil palm. Palm oil is a wonderful, wonderful product. It would be hard to invent a better product in many ways. It's productive, produces 8 times more oil per area than soybean. It grows rapidly. You can get a harvest in a few years. It employs millions of people, helps the national GDP. It's cheap, trans fat free, and all around, it's just a really, really valuable, useful, relatively inexpensive product. Now the bad. Well, it's associated with deforestation, loss of biodiversity, peatland draining, burning, and climate change. So the question for conservation, the question for all of us as consumers, how do you balance the good and the bad? How do you factor in then the ugly? How many of you have been to Malaysian Borneo, Sabah, and Sarawak? Well, 50% of the Malaysian Borneo rainforest has been destroyed, not all due to oil palm, but oil palm is implicated in a lot of that. Global demand for oil palm is going to increase hugely in the next few years. It's responsible for human rights abuses and land grabs, child labor, cultural loss, and loss of biodiversity. So here's the conundrum, and we love conundrums. And by the way, conundrums are great devices to use in your writing. And I'll try to throw in a few writing ideas as we go along. That you don't have to have all the answers. You can present conflicts, and questions are wonderful devices to get the reader interested, involve the reader, involve the audience. 50% of all the items in your supermarket contain oil palm. Think about that. Open your refrigerator, open your cupboard. 1 out of every 2 items has palm oil in it. Why? It's terrific. Look what it does. Read this list. Well, we all want crunchy fried foods, don't we? We all want a longer shelf life. Palm oil helps us do that. Now, all over the world, consumers are being scolded. And how do you feel about being scolded? How does your kid feel like this cartoon? How does your child feel when he or she is scolded? Is that a good tactic to say, don't use oil palm? Well, maybe it is. But maybe it can backfire. Maybe people get fed up and say, leave me alone. This scolding resulted in some interesting news stories recently. This is a story you may have seen from the Associated Press that came out about 3 months ago. Here's what happened. In America, the Girl Scouts make money by selling Girl Scout cookies. And there was a young Girl Scout, I think she was 11, named Olivia Chaffin from the US state of Tennessee. And she was out selling her Girl Scout cookies, and she looked at the list of ingredients and she saw palm oil. And she said, no, I've been told that palm oil is bad. And I've been told that it leads to child labor. And Olivia Chaffin said, this young girl shouldn't be out in the sun doing manual labor, helping her father work for an international conglomerate producing oil palm. She should be in school. Now, you could argue that this is a spoiled Western view of the world. But get a hold of this article because it is interesting of how the theoretical idea of something called child labor has affected consumers in different parts of the world. Here's another news story that just came out 3 days ago in Canada about something called Buttergate. Now, this wasn't a conservation story, it was a baking story, it was a COVID story, it was a home cooking story where because of COVID, a lot of Canadian Canadians were baking more than they had been. And they found that the butter they were using to make their apple pie, their crumble, their brownies, was harder than usual. And they complained. And what they found out was that palm oil is used a lot in agriculture. The palm oil helps cows produce more milk with more fat content. So there's a lot of implications. There's a lot of threads to the story. There's a lot of angles you can approach it from. But let's go back. What happens when you turn a rainforest into a desert? The first issue that we have to address is how it affects people. And here are some of the people I've had the pleasure to meet in Sarawak and in Indonesian Kalimantan. And then, of course, there's the emotional aspect. And these are probably going to be the most depressing pictures that you'll see all day. The orangutans in the damaged rainforest, completely damaged like this, are basically stuffed. I was trying to think of a more emotional word, emotional verb, but I'll leave it with that word, stuffed. And this picture is taken from a video. You could find it on YouTube. And what you have up here is a big land clearing machine. And the orangutan actually in the video is scared and he's disoriented and he goes and he tries to fight with the machine. It's heartbreaking stuff. So this is what we're dealing with. What happens to people? What happens to wildlife? What happens to biodiversity? How do we balance the good stuff with the bad stuff? Now, what are the solutions? I know that all of you in the audience worked in conservation, some with me. And we've tried lots of different things. And you can have a look at this list. These are things that have been going on for a long time. They're continuing, and they're important. And this is the dilemma. This is the problem faced by the two main characters in EarthLove. Two women named Rima and Olivia. Rima and Olivia were very well educated, very rich, very focused, and very frustrated. And they said, we have an NGO that is doing all of these things and nothing's working. We haven't solved the problem. And their problem, because they were based in Borneo, their problem was oil palm destroying rainforests. So they went off-piste. They went a little bit crazy. Well, they went a lot crazy, and they tried to do things that were illegal, immoral, unethical. In the end, not terribly successful. But I'll let you read the book to figure that out for yourself. But I tried to make it, that's where the satire comes in. Writing humor is very difficult because people have different senses of humor. And I can't tell if you're laughing at my jokes or you're falling asleep. And it's a wonderful tactic to use in your writing if you can get away with it. I don't know if I've got away with it. You have to decide that for yourself. But sometimes these things are so important, so difficult to understand, so heavy that you have to laugh at it. And maybe by laughing at it, we can introduce new ideas and new people and new ways of thinking into the argument. But as I said, Rima and Olivia, they went all Thelma and Louise. They went off the deep end. And that's what I try to do in the book, is to explore what happens when people get so frustrated that they take actions beyond the normal activities of press releases and scientific reports and white papers and task forces and recommendations and treaties and so on. I get tired just talking about it. All writing needs good guys and bad guys. If we have time at the end of this presentation, I've prepared 3 writing tips that might be of interest to people who are writing both personal essays, personal memoir, but also writing fiction. We need conflict. Conflict is the driver of the story. Without a problem, you've got no story. The bigger the problem, the bigger the bad guy, the bigger the villain, the bigger the stakes, the bigger the hero. Please keep that in mind when you're writing, is if your writing seems a bit flat, make the problem bigger. What we're seeing is going back to the old days of WWF is charismatic megavertebrates. And a lot of the social messaging, a lot of the social impact is regularly involving cute animals. The more cute animals you have, the more social impact you have. And it's a very contemporary theme. On March 7th, that's this coming Sunday, in Switzerland, there's going to be a referendum. The Swiss love their referendums. They have referendums about everything. And this particular referendum is whether Switzerland should approve a free trade agreement with Indonesia. Are they talking about, the people against it are not talking about economics, they're talking about palm oil. And what visual are they using to show their issue? They're using fire, a mother orangutan, and a baby orangutan. So watch this space. We'll see how this vote turns out in a week's time. But here's what people are, campaigners in conservation, are focusing on. This little guy, how could you not love this little guy? I don't know, have any of you ever been up close and personal with an orangutan? It's one of the life-changing experiences that I've had, to actually be sitting with rehabilitant orangutans, or else seeing wild orangutans in the forest. And you have to have a connection with these guys. You have to have an emotional connection. How could you not love these guys? You can love them so much that you can adopt one. Now, a lot of this conservation work is being done by NGOs, and I think most of them are doing a pretty good job. They're not universally loved by all the governments in Asia. They're accused, sometimes just rightly, that they're foreign influenced organizations. Is that a bad thing? Well, the underlying subtext of a lot of conversations I've had with ministers of environment, ministers of forests, policymakers, has been, don't tell us what to do. They're also telling this to the local NGOs, and there are a lot of very good NGOs, and I urge you to support some of the smaller NGOs working on this conservation issue. Don't tell us what to do. Now, let me tell you a story. We were invited to dinner at the home of the ambassador to the World Trade Organization from, let's say, a major Southeast Asian country with rainforests and oil palm. And I think it was my fault. I brought up the subject of rainforest and conservation and oil palm. And the woman, lady ambassador, said, well, you foreigners use our oil palm, use our palm oil, but you care more about orangutans than you do about people. And that's the feeling that is quite common. It's very defensive. Now, I'm in a privileged position living in Switzerland. I don't live in Malaysia. I don't live in Indonesia. What can we do? What should we do? And I'd like to ask you a question. And this is the moment, if we were doing this as a live presentation, I would ask you to stand up, stretch a little bit, turn to your neighbor, and have a discussion and ask two questions. Are you optimistic about nature's future? And if not, what should we do about it? So if you don't have a neighbor handy, grab a cat and just have a little thought about what's going on. And I hope that you'll be offering some suggestions, not just questions, but ideas and feelings about what needs to be done. Maybe everything's okay. Maybe it'll all sort itself out. Okay. If you're not too optimistic about it, what steps should we take? And again, I'll bring it back to the book, that people in the book went over and above. They went off the deep end. And that's one way to approach it. Should we be doing more of the same? More international treaties, more charters for nature, more laws, better enforcement? Should we be doing more industry certification of palm oil? Should we be looking at genetically modified palm oil to produce more crop? Should we be looking at other oil sources? It's up to you. So that's what I have for the first part of the presentation. And for Alicia, really it's your call whether you'd like to look at some of the questions and discussions now, or whether we go into the next part of it, which would be some tips for writing. I'll turn it back to you, Alicia.
Well, I think we still have quite a bit of time. So, and I know that among the people who are joining us today, there was interest particularly on your tips for writing. So if you can proceed, I would like to ask you to proceed with the tips for writers.
Happy.
Thank you.
How many of you are writing or making presentations? This is very frustrating to do this stuff on Zoom, because I really would like to see you. I'd really like to be able to get your reaction. Patricia, well, Patricia raised her hand. Thank you very much. These tips are from my book, Share Your Journey. And perhaps they will help you make your writing more impactful, creating intimacy. And everything I'm going to say is a suggestion. At the end of the day, it's your name on the article, it's your name on the book. Let's see what we have. The first tip is realize that you have a choice. And the choice is between cold and hot. And this is a spectrum. It's not a binary choice. It's finding out where you're comfortable on this spectrum. How much brain you want, how much heart you want. What do we mean by this? Cold writing, left brain writing, is giving people information. Hot communication is giving people ideas. Are you writing a school report or a scientific paper? Are you telling a story? Are you dealing in facts and statistics? You're dealing with dreams. You have to decide this for yourself, and it has to be based on your interests and your audience's interest. And let me be clear, we really want accuracy, we really want facts, we really want information. And that's important. But we also want to create an intimacy with the reader. And that's where the art comes in. Because you've got a voice. All these singers have voices. You have a voice. You have a writing voice, you have a speaking voice, you have a physical voice, the way you wear your hair, the clothes, the way you walk. All this is yours. And the reader has a voice too. The reader may be a Pavarotti fan, it may be a Mick Jagger fan. How do you adjust that? The second tip that I'd like to offer you is the idea of no. Now this is based on a very simple idea of conflict. Yes, I will. No, you won't. Yes, I want to save the rainforest. Somebody else says, no, you won't. Yes, I want to live a happy life, says the villager in Kalimantan. No, you won't, says somebody else from the government or the business. Yes, I want to live in the rainforest and have babies, says the orangutan. No, you won't, says the guy with the chainsaw. Conflict is essential. And I call this the Nancy Reagan principle. Do you remember Nancy Reagan, the wife of Ronald Reagan? She was asked, what's your solution to the drug problem in America? And she said, just say no. And this is my way of remembering this concept. Whenever I'm writing anything, I think, what would Nancy Reagan say? How do you bring in the negative? How do you bring in the opposition into your story? Because without a problem or without a villain, you have no solution. That solution usually comes in the form of a hero. So you see this kind of idea in every book you read, every movie you see. Let's take, we talked about Thelma and Louise. They had a big problem. And the stakes became higher and higher and higher. Look at Lord of the Rings. Frodo didn't wake up in the morning and say, hey, I'm going to be the hero of 3 very large books. He was put in a position where he had to do what? He had to take the ring, throw the ring into the fire, because if he didn't, what were the stakes? Well, humanity would be destroyed. The whole world would be destroyed. Big stakes, big issues. Independence Day, do you remember that? Aliens want to take over the world. And the world, in this case, particularly the United States, because it's a Hollywood movie, said, no, you can't do it. and there's a big fight. Very big stakes into thin air. John Krakauer wanted to climb the mountain, and the mountain said no. Other people queuing up on the mountain said no. The weather says no. The lack of oxygen says no. Consider your no, consider your problem. And here's an easy tip. There are a few really simple words you can use to create conflict in your story, but however, nevertheless, in spite of. And these force the reader, force your audience to think what's going on, what are the solutions, what's the problem, how does she get out of this situation, who's going to come to the rescue, who are the allies, who are the opponents. Try it, it works very well to say, on the one hand, we have this situation, but on the other hand, we have this situation. However, this is going on. A related idea is the idea of the open loop. And what I mean by that is you don't have to give away all the answers or all the solution at the beginning. Now, do you remember the story of Shahryar and Scheherazade? Shahryar was a prince, and he was a playboy prince, and he had a huge harem. And he would go every afternoon into the harem and say, okay, you come with me tonight. And Scheherazade was a young girl, just new to the harem. And one day he said, okay, Scheherazade, it's your turn tonight. And she's a young girl, she was scared, she didn't know what to do, but she was a clever girl. And she went to him knowing that all of the previous girls who went with Shahryar were killed by sunrise. She said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. And she started to tell him a story. And the story was so interesting that the time passed, and she told him the story, and one thing led to another. And then about 5:30 in the morning, the roosters start crowing and the dawn starts coming up. And she was still alive because Shahryar was so enchanted by her story. And she said, okay, Miss, my prince, see you next time. Thanks very much for a nice evening. And she's off. And she kept that up for 1,001 nights because she didn't finish the story. She started it, she made it more complicated, but she kept him hanging on. And the third tip, the last one that I'll give you today, is the idea of start with a bang. One of the best ways to start a story is to start, in Latin it's called in medias res. Who remembers, how many of you remember your school Latin? It means in the middle of things. And a good time to start the story is when this guy is about to be smashed by this train. You don't really want to start the story with this guy waking up, brushing his teeth, having his morning yogurt and cereal, reading the newspaper. You don't want to take too long because we live in a very fast culture. If you look at most detective stories, if you read a detective book, there should be a body on the first page. Set it up quickly, and then you can go back and say, what's this guy doing here? Why is he about to get smashed by a train? And you can do this in many situations. Let's take this guy in a kayak. you might start the story, and it's better if you're the guy in the kayak telling the story. You're swimming along and somebody in an adjacent kayak says, hey, look behind you. And he sees this big shark coming after him. That's starting with a bang. William Tell, you all know the story. A good place to start the story is William Tell taking his crossbow, taking aim, and getting ready to pull the trigger, hoping that he hits the apple and not his son. Take a bungee cord jump. Have any of you ever bungee jumped? Well, you're standing, let's say you're writing a first-person memoir. You're standing up on the platform. You've got these cords wrapped around your legs, and the bungee master is counting down. 3, 2, and you say to yourself, what the hell am I doing here? 1, and stop. Then you can tell people how you got there, why you're doing this thing, how you've wanted to do it your whole life, but how terrified you are. And then at the end, you can come back and tell people, I jumped, I didn't jump. So these are all ideas that we have in the writing workshop, that we have in the book. And I hope that helps you a little bit. This is not an easy thing, and I commend anybody who's trying to write and tell your story, because it's not easy to expose yourself. It's not easy to express your feelings and share ideas with other people. Some people will love you. Some people will love you a little bit less, but that's okay. You've got the courage to do it, and good for you. Keep at it. So thank you very much for that. And I think we better get started on some questions.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for that really interesting lecture. I think you like to keep us on, like in your book, keep it suspenseful and keep us on tenterhooks, keep us guessing. So, because this, like I think everybody's aware, the problem of conservation